I think the first weapon that they use is that if you don't believe what we say, then you are bigoted and hateful. That's kind of the starting point. And it's sort of an unspoken truth, because if anybody does really come outside the box and say, whoa, wait a minute, this isn't right, they are immediately attacked in any way possible.
Dr. Quentin Van Meter is the president of the American College of Pediatricians and a well-known pediatric endocrinologist who has been sounding the alarm on the affirmation-only approach that doctors are taking to children who identify as transgender. This affirmation-only philosophy, which is under the umbrella of so-called gender-affirming care, refers to a child's notion of their so-called gender identity. This gender identity might even be the opposite sex, and it is, under this paradigm, supposed to be immediately and unquestionably affirmed. And it's wreaking medical havoc, harming children and families alike. In this second episode of Generation Indoctrination, we'll take a deeper look into the world of medicine and the institutional power, especially in the corporate media, that's working to further this ideology. Those who dare to criticize or challenge it are often silenced or shamed in order to make them fall in line. I asked Dr. Van Meter how this has all happened so quickly. Dr. Van Meter, it sure seems that a crucial part of how this has been allowed to escalate with such rapid speed is a sort of stealthy institutional capture, which then allows it to spread like wildfire, and media will defer to groups like the World Professional Association for Transgender Health, WPATH for short, and that's an activist group. It's not a group of pediatricians or doctors. These are activists. There might be some doctors among them, but so from your point of view, how has this ideology spread so quickly through all of the professional societies?
Through colleagues in their academic institutions, their division heads who will say, I'm sorry, you're not speaking for this university. This is your personal opinion, and this is bigoted and hateful, and we'll have none of it. And if you don't retract what you wrote, we're going to have to reconsider whether or not you'll achieve tenure and whether or not you can publish in journals, because you're representing us, even though the article states that it's your personal opinion. If you're from our institution, we are going to be branded as promoting this with our faculty members, and we'll have none of it. So that's how it's browbeating, and that's how they basically work with the society at large, with physicians at large. So the Endocrine Society publishes these guys. There were 9 individuals who got together and what they call a special interest group, or a SIG. And they get together. They're all on the same page. I mean, this is what they believe. And they just sort of talk amongst themselves and pat each other on the back and say, hi, how are you doing? Yeah, let's get this done. I like this idea. I like this idea. Well, this is even better. This is what we're doing in our center. Let's put this in as a recommendation for care. We'd really like to get past these idiots who are in the way.
This pressure in the medical field isn't limited to the physicians at the helm of influential entities governing professional protocols and their public policy stances. It is also felt in the doctor's offices and involves the coercion of parents, moms and dads who are, many times, already reeling in confusion over the internal turmoil their children are experiencing. The affirmation-only approach seizes upon this frenzy to push parents toward affirming and even transitioning their children. While a handful of European nations are now moving away from this medicalized pathway, the United States and Canada appear to be proceeding full speed ahead. Dr. Andre Van Mol, a family medicine doctor in Redding, California, has seen the tragic ways families have fallen prey to these manipulative dynamics within hospitals and medical clinics.
As you know, in the United Kingdom, Sweden, Finland, 3 nations that were leading in this whole gender-affirming therapy because of complaints and scientific literature reviews, actions of divisions of government, scientific organizations, medical. They've done a virtual 180 from, being strong sponsors of gender-affirming therapy to saying this will not happen whatsoever medically under 16 years of age. Between 16 and 18, it will only happen under great restriction, under very tightly supervised studies. They all acknowledge that after all these years, it remains experimental, not proven safe, not proven effective, and that it actually can't show that it does what it's claiming to do in improving the mental health, let alone suicide reduction of the people who partake. And yet, as the activists go around discussing it, it's all, it's either, gender affirming therapy or people are going to kill themselves. and the kind of intimidation that's thrown at parents. You know, do you want a live son or a dead daughter? Do you want to be planning a transition or a funeral? And it's incredible that people are hearing this from their, healthcare and mental health professionals. But you can imagine the crisis a parent feels. They know their kid has other problems. The other problems are being ignored, great concerns, yet these authority figures in their life are throwing these kind of threats at them. It's hugely disorienting for a parent.
These issues are particularly horrific, considering the force with which they have been pursued and the flippancy with which life-altering interventions, especially in children, have been taken by doctors. This has hit a fever pitch in Europe, where the UK National Health Service is shuttering the gender identity clinic at the Tavistock and Portman Trust, the London-based facility whose practices have faced considerable scrutiny in recent years. This infamous gender clinic, which oversaw the administration of puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones to minors, is facing a potential massive class action lawsuit in what one lawyer called one of the largest medical negligence scandals of all time. It's a tragic culmination that comes after years of horrific actions being taken without regard for facts or science. That's something I recently sat down to discuss with filmmaker and bioethicist Jennifer Lahl. So Jennifer, when we consider biomedical ethics in this space, medical practices and procedures that would have been considered unthinkable just a short time ago, maybe 10 or 15 years ago, 50 years ago, perhaps they were occurring sparsely, but now it's just, you see it everywhere, and it's astonishing to look at this. And so from your experience as one who knows the bioethics world, where do you think the first breakdown in ethical standards started in a contemporary sense?
Well, that's a very big question. And, this is, of course, my point of view. For your listeners' benefit, I worked in hospital clinical nursing for some 20 years. So I would say 25, 30 years ago, we did see shifts away from, I give the example often that as a nurse, we had patients, we had physicians, and then by the time I left nursing, we had clients and customers. We moved from what was used to be seen negatively as the paternalistic model of medicine, the doctor knows best. You don't question the doctor, you do whatever the doctor tells you because he's the expert. To, by the time I left clinical nursing, people would walk in, they had done their Google search and they would say, doctor, I think I have X, Y, and Z, and I'd like you to order, CAT scans and these kind of lab tests. And doctors would just comply because this shift in medicine from recognizing that doctors have expertise. I mean, they in fact went to medical school, to that their role was just to provide services to whatever their customer demanded. And so I think that was a breakdown. And at that time we shifted from what used to be medical ethics to bioethics, which is sort of ethics by committee. So we moved from now we have, policymakers telling medical doctors how to practice. We have lawyers, impacting medical practice oftentimes through just litigation and lawsuits. We have pharmaceutical companies, weighing in and lobbying with their big pharma money with what they think medicine should do and how physicians ought to operate. So I think in that kind of milieu and landscape, those sort of titanic shifts landed us to where we are today, where I hear from medical students all the time that they have very little ethics training. They're just being skilled in being technicians without even saying, should I be doing this? Is this what I ought to be doing? The few physicians that are still sort of standing and sort of holding back the tides, if you will, are really taking hits. They're being ostracized. They're being threatened to, lose insurance coverage. Insurance providers aren't going to work with them. Hospitals aren't going to give them privileges if they don't perform certain ways and certain procedures.
Along the way, Jennifer Lahl stressed that these shifts impacted the core beliefs at the center of medical ethics, shifting doctors' approaches away from individual needs and toward patients' various whims.
When you look at the foundational beliefs that should be behind good, ethical, proper, what I call ethical and proper medicine, Hippocratic kind of medicine, is what is the ethical framework that's at play. And today, the ethical framework that's at play is often utilitarianism, the greatest good for the greatest number, instead of looking at each patient as an individual and what does this particular patient need, which might be different than, a utilitarian kind of argument that we're going to practice medicine so that we can deliver care, to the maximum amount of people. When I was in graduate school, there was what we called the Georgetown mantra, which was, beneficence, non-maleficence, beneficence, do good, non-maleficence, don't do bad, autonomy, the patient is an autonomous individual that should have a voice in what we do to them or don't do to them, and justice. Well, each 4 points of those, we can't even agree on what is justice. What is do no harm? In the trans lobby, do no harm, one camp is we have to affirm gender transition in minors, or we're harming them. And then the other side, we're like, no, that is harmful to do to minors, to chop off healthy breast tissue or to sterilize children. So we can't even agree on the language anymore. So we don't have a shared common ethical framework like we did 50 years ago when, like I said in my first things piece, medical doctors would just say, well, no, we're not going to do that. That's not what's indicated here. That's not what this patient needs. That's not for the good of this patient. So when we don't have a shared value system or shared meaning to the words that we use, like justice and autonomy.
I had the chance to ask Dr. Van Mol about some of the dangers surrounding fast-tracking kids into medicalization in this transgender craze. Dr. Van Mol, could you explain what are the worst risks when a child is fast-tracked on this pathway? What are the worst things that can happen if he or she goes on blockers or cross-sex hormones and then maybe even goes on to a cosmetic gender surgery?
Well, you asked about the worst case scenario, and that's death by suicide. And again, transition affirmation, gender affirming therapy is not proven to improve mental health or to reduce suicide. And the best studies have the worst results. But this study out of Sweden, from around 2011 or so, that looked at all sex reassignment surgery patients in Sweden over 30 years. If you follow them out 10 years, not 6 months, 1 year, 2 year, the honeymoon period that most studies tend to stop in, but you follow them 10 years or more, they have a completed suicide rate 19 times that of the general population, 3 times the all-cause mortality, meaning all the things that can kill someone, and about 3 times the rate of psychiatric hospitalization. No improvement there. And in 2019, a different electronic medical review of the entire nation of Sweden, Brandstrom and Pachankas, ultimately showed that both gender-affirming hormones and gender-affirming surgery did nothing to improve the psychological endpoints that they looked at. So here are 2 of the best studies of their kind showing it didn't change much. And there's all kinds of sub-studies that can bring up stuff out of Denmark and other places showing it didn't really help much. And it didn't help no matter how supportive the general population was. If you're looking for suicide reduction, this isn't it. The package insert of, for example, Lupron, the main puberty blocker used in the United States, has specific warning in there about the risk of depression, self-harmful behavior, a low rate of suicide attempts. Well, really, this is something I'd put someone on who's threatening to kill themselves if they're not on puberty blockers. That doesn't sound right. The more immediate physiologic problems is it impairs fertility. And if you're on it long enough, it's the end of your fertility because the sperm and egg never have a chance to develop. Certainly, if you follow puberty blockers with cross-sex hormones, you're sterile. And that is on the gender clinic site of UC San Francisco. It is in the consent documents that Children's Hospital LA has children and parents sign. They're going to be part of their program. So a lot harder for the other side to deny or just say we're making up. So there's the infertility problem. There's the sexual dysfunction that comes with it. Bone building, increase in bone mineral density in puberty is its zenith for life. So if you flatten that, now is this kid going to have osteopenia or even osteoporosis at remarkably young years? Where are the studies, showing safety on that? It affects psychology, obviously people going through that puberty window with their peers and you block that, you can never have that time window back and all that comes with it. So yeah, there's a lot going on that way. And that's just talking about, and of course, the other side has loved to say that puberty blockers are completely reversible. They're not. That was already in the literature at the time they're telling us, oh no, it's totally fine. No, it's not. Even stopping it short, there's studies showing a percentage of the people claim persistent side effects from having been on it. So that reversibility claim is quite questionable.
While many have ignored this, it does seem that there is a slow and steady realization that something might be going terribly wrong, and that a horrible medical scandal is brewing. At the least, some critics are finally starting to ask essential questions, and at the same time, Dr. Van Meter believes that we're just beginning to hear the stories and see the actions that could right some of these wrongs.
The one most effective spokespeople is Walt Heyer, the man who grew up as the biologic male he was, and who in his midlife left his wife and 2 children and lived as a woman for 10 or 11 years, and then realized that everything was broken all along, and he came back from that journey, detransitioned, and is now a spokesman. He has Change Regret website for people to come to, and he gets thousands of hits per month from people who are saying, I'm in this pickle, or I was thinking about doing this, talk me out of it. And so he is well past the statute of limitations, as are many of the adults that are coming out of the woodwork to decry this. But there is now a new generation of, particularly of females who have transitioned in their late teens, early 20s, who have lasted as little as a year, and they've come back from that. And they are within the statute of limitations, so they're starting to formulate cases against the physicians and the healthcare systems and the pharmaceutical companies who provide the medication. So I think this is where we'll see some resolution of this, and the quicker the sooner, as I always say.
Dr. Van Mol agrees that a resolution to the horrors could be on the horizon, and shared some of his own take on this consequential matter.
Things are happening in the shadows, and, people assumed certain things, and it's pretty easy for people to look the other way, especially when you really don't know what's going on. Let me give you an example of an endocrinology colleague of mine who lives in the same state, California, and he was presenting to a group of legislators, basically congressmen and senators in Washington, who are themselves doctors. That, this NIH experiment, the first of its kind, $5.7 million experiment in 4 different centers in the US, the first to look at the medical effects of puberty blockers in minors, and only the second to look at the mental health effects. That this is not just being done down to 12 years of age, which already shocked the legislators. They didn't know it was done that young. But he showed them the document by which the pediatrician at Children's Hospital LA got the rules changed for the study mid-flight, and it was being done down to 8 years of age. And the room lit up. These people were infuriated. They're physicians themselves, albeit they legislators, and they had no idea what was going on in the nation that they're in the House of Representatives and the Senate representing. And then when he showed from the same pediatrician at Children's Hospital LA, an article in the peer review literature proving that they were doing mastectomies in girls down to 13 years of age. It's just unbelievable if you didn't know it was happening. And it shouldn't be, and it won't be happening long. This is all going to go down, but we don't want to wait until it simply goes down by the weight of its scientific frailty. This is all, again, low quality, poor quality data in these publications that are supporting the stuff. As proper science is being applied to it, it'll be obvious this is nowhere's land, and it's not something we should be doing. But that kind of process takes 10, 15, 20 years. When the kids and the families that have gone down this path and that are devastated by it, don't just sue the doctors and hospitals, but the insurance companies, the pharmaceutical firms, the biotech companies, all the way up the chain. That's when this thing's going to stop, because it's going to be shown that it's not this cash cow that it is now.
One of the most disturbing aspects of the affirmation-only approach, according to Dr. Van Mol, are the data points that show that young people might outgrow a transgender identity, a development that's shielded and prevented when doctors and institutions push children into these life-altering and permanent procedures.
Once you medicalize someone for what is basically a mental health problem. And by the way, we have decades of literature showing very strong support for the idea that gender dysphoric youth will overwhelmingly desist conservatively 85% of the time by adulthood if they're simply left alone. Now, that statistic is compromised if you affirm, obviously, that's confusing for a kid. But you're talking about a mental health situation, the overwhelming probability for which is desistance by adulthood. But now you medicalize it. Well, that kid come adult is medicalized for the rest of his or her life. The persistent need for the cross-sex hormones, surgery if they engage in it, the complications of both leading to need for other medications and further surgery, they are profitable for the rest of their life. It's disgusting to talk about. It's the worst possible face of capitalism, but it's going on.
While critics dismiss these claims, as mentioned earlier, an increasing number of detransition stories brutally expose the collateral damage. A British man named Richie Herron recently announced his intentions to sue the United Kingdom's National Health Service for allegedly not properly considering his mental health struggles before giving him transgender surgery. He reportedly woke up from his 2018 surgery with regret after his penis and testicles were removed. He now believes it was the biggest mistake of his life. Considering the medical community's handling of these issues, one wonders how many more are like him. Unfortunately, though, troubles don't just exist inside the institutions. They're also reinforced and cheered on in the culture. Investigative journalist Jennifer Billick has explored these issues in detail.
I mean, look at all the celebration around these identities, these fictitious synthetic identities. It's supported and celebrated in all media. If you're going to take drugs and you're going to carve your body up to express yourself, this is celebratory. People magazine put Jazz Jennings, a young boy who's been in the talk show circuit since he was 4 years old because his parents said he was a girl, and now he's in his 20s and he's had myriad surgeries. People magazine had him on the cover celebrating his penis goodbye party.
According to Billick, the media complex simply parrots the medical mantras being perpetuated. It's a vicious cycle of justification that simply reiterates what's being said, irrespective of the medical or ethical soundness.
If you go to, say, Glamour magazine, Variety magazine, Salon magazine, blah, 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 you think you're reading a particular individual platform. But what you're reading is one platform that's part of a conglomerate, a massive conglomerate. And all of these conglomerates have a massive health platform. So they're integrally tied to the medical industrial complex. Now, so the medical industrial complex is driving these identities for profit. So they're going to drive them through these media platforms. I made a list of their different platforms and how each of them are supporting this narrative of transgenderism being cool. So they're all sending out the same messages at the same time that are supporting medical platforms, these medical industries. It's pretty wild how it's all connected.
Lisa Salin Davis, who is the author of the book Tomboy, The Surprising History and Future of Girls Who Dare to Be Different, is a political liberal who has been critical of the left's approach to gender issues. And she's experienced the same media suppression in her own reporting. In 2017, she wrote a viral op-ed in the New York Times titled, "My Daughter is Not Transgender, She's a Tomboy," which was the beginning of her journey into the abyss.
After that op-ed in 2017, I was contacted by people saying things that sounded like right-wing conspiracy theory. The main thing they were saying is pharmaceutical companies are conducting experiments on gay kids. And I was like, well, I mean, maybe, but I can't write about that. And one thing I really took to heart was, in my own kind of letting myself be indoctrinated, was you're going to hurt people if you say the wrong thing about this, or if you question or probe or dissent. For years, I was writing in ways that were very, very carefully, that I would just hint at, maybe it's more complicated than we're making it seem. I accepted the idea of gender identity, even though part of me was like, do I have a gender identity? Is there a thing called cisgender? I don't know. But, I was just allowing it to go through, but questioning on the side I think what finally broke me was reading the desistance literature, and that 70 to 85, sometimes more % of kids in these 11 studies that had been referred for gender dysphoria, whether they met the diagnostic criteria or not, that the vast majority of them desisted. And of those, the vast majority were gay. So that's when the right-wing conspiracy theory that was, first of all, told to me by full lefties, there was nothing right-wing about it. I had been taught to think that way about anything that interrupted this kind of left narrative. That's when I thought, oh, those people are actually, there is something going on that we have to look into. And then I just spent a year interviewing people and really diving deep into the science and realizing that it does not actually support the affirmative approach, not really at all. And it might support a few kids after very careful evaluation, possibly going on to medical treatments, but it didn't support much else of what was actually happening. It didn't support the left-wing kind of dogma. It didn't support what we were teaching children in schools.
But when Lisa tried to write about these issues and publish in well-known media outlets, she hit roadblocks.
I tried so hard to write about these stories and to write about the people getting hurt. I pitched to every possible left-wing outlet, and I got almost nothing. I had one op-ed in the San Francisco Chronicle, and I had one op-ed in Newsweek, which tends to run fairly conservative op-eds. And I also didn't get paid for either of those. So that was a year of work and 2 unpaid assignments. And not only was I not able to place these articles, but many of the people who had hired me regularly as a freelancer stopped hiring me. I think it was even pitching the articles signaled to editors that I was not a safe person to be associated with. And the result of that, the result of the difference in the way the left and the right are reporting on this, and I'm not a huge fan of the way the right is reporting on it either, but at least they tend to have their science right. And the result of not allowing us to tell this story in its full complexity is that we are not dealing with the same set of facts, and we are not dealing with the science. We are not interpreting the science in the same way. So what I found is that all my fellow lefties who haven't gone down the rabbit hole themselves and learned about this themselves, that they're poorly informed about this subject.
It's not just a media problem, though. Dr. Van Mol noted how the entertainment complex also steps in to promote these narratives, convincing people that transitioning is the best way to handle gender issues.
It's groupthink. I mean, this movement is very well organized, being driven by big money, philanthropic money, obviously the people who immediately profit, big pharmaceutical firms, biotech, that kind of thing. And, obviously, whatever administration is in office federally is going to make a difference. But basically, they just rode this in on the coattails of the gay rights movement and the Obergefell decision. And people get upset when you say that, these are two different things. That may be, but the mechanisms that were in place were easily co-opted to buying off on this idea that, transgenderism and transgender equality was the next great battlefield for civil rights and human rights. Now, when I saw that happening, and it was so obvious, I just thought people would see right through it, and I was wrong. They didn't. And now we have a situation where corporate America is all over it. And again, these big activist groups that are promoting this with the full help of corporate America. So now it's the entertainment industry, the media, corporate America, and the education system that are pretty much, I try to avoid terms like brainwashed, but that have been indoctrinated pretty solidly that there's one way to think on this. And otherwise, you're a hater and a bigot and a phobe. And the other side doesn't have to come up with anything more clever than calling people haters and bigots and phobes. And people seem to scatter.
With biomedical ethics in crisis, it's easy to wonder how we arrived at this precarious place. When asked to pinpoint the single greatest contributing factor to this near-total collapse, Dr. Van Meter was candid.
I think the big thing is the acceptance of a new dogma not based on science, that it is presented with sort of a bullying to it, so that if you do not accept this, you will be chastised, you will be criticized, you will be decredentialed if we have the power to do so. We're right, you're wrong, shut up and go away. And, we as physicians, I actually took the Hippocratic Oath that actually stated do no harm back in 1973 when I graduated from med school. All the things in the Hippocratic Oath you read about, I will not perform abortions, I will not harm patients, I will not take the life of, I will not assist in suicide for the patient. All of those things were in there. They are being watered out by the sort of the general, very, very progressive bent of university centers. Universities are now trying to madly develop a curriculum to support the fact that they have transgender clinics, and they're doing these things. So they say, quick, let's create some science. Hey guys down below, we need some science. Quick, let's get it in the medical school curriculum. Let's do this. Let's be, socially sensitive. Let's get our diversity and equity things up. And all of this under the guise of basically producing a real Holocaust of stuff that's going to come back to bite us. The way this will be solved, as Paul McHugh told me 6 or 7 years ago when I first met him, is it will be solved by the malpractice suits that will be forthcoming, and that will take this house of cards down by its knees.
The failure of medical institutions and communication channels is evident, and the resulting fallout is tragic. From maimed individuals who changed their minds to the family structures and parental rights conundrums, we're just beginning to see the impact of the transgender craze. For Lisa Davis, the impact on families is especially troubling.
The scariest part about this gender revolution for me is the emphasis on family abolition. The idea that if your parents are unsupportive, you should reject them, that children should be removed from families that don't wish to medically or socially transition a child. There is research, decent research, that says familial support is key to LGBT children. And that does not necessarily mean that support is affirmation, but it means that you keep the child in your life, the child keeps the parent in his or her life, that you try to stay connected, you try to figure out how to connect across difference. And the woman who designed that research has worked with families where even parents were horribly abusive, and she still tried to keep the family intact. She tried to get them to come to a place of understanding of one another. And somehow that has been interpreted by a kind of very extreme, I'm not even sure they're left, I think they're more in outer space than left, but that's been interpreted as the family unit should be destroyed if the parents are not affirming. And you are mostly talking these days about teenagers with complicated mental health profiles.
As the nation fractures over this difficult issue, one fact remains clear. Trust in the medical community is in crisis. Given the painful stories that are being suppressed, Lisa is hopeful that the truth will ultimately prevail.
My hope is that we can move past framing this as a left-right issue and really try to evaluate it from a scientific, medical, psychological perspective, and really ask ourselves what's best for these children and stop politicizing it, because I think it's causing a kind of national sickness. But I am deeply, deeply disappointed at the left and mainstream media's unwillingness to do their job and investigate this away from their own political biases and simply try to tell a complicated truth, tell the stories of the people who've been hurt, not just the people who've been helped.
Next time on Generation Indoctrination, we will engage the philosophical history of gender ideology in an attempt to answer the questions, how did we get here? And where do we go from here? Stay tuned.